Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Louise Barrett. She is Professor of Psychology and Canada Research Chair in Cognition, Evolution, and Behaviour at the University of Lethbridge in Canada. Her research program centers on the issue of how ecology shapes patterns of sociality and cognitive evolution, and includes work on thermal physiology and responses to climate change, parental investment strategies, cooperation, sexual conflict, movement ecology, and infant development. And she's the author of books like Beyond the Brain, How Body and Environment Shape Animal and Human Minds. So, Louise, I will try to call you that. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I mean, it's interesting because I invited you to talk about evolutionary psychology, but I know you
Yeah.
focus a lot of your work on ecology, behavioral ecology, ecological factors. So I would like to ask you first, how do you look at the influence of ecological factors and behavioral ecology in the broader context of evolution by natural selection?
Right. Yeah, no, so I think, when you say you invited me to talk about evolutionary psychology, I also think that that applies to animals, non-human animals as well as us. So to me, it's all
Sure.
part of the same thing. Um, so yeah, I think ecology is, ecological factors are a central part of studying evolution by natural selection because variation is the engine of selection, and behavioral ecology is all about context and variation. So it's about how ecological variation influences the evolutionary strategies that animals employ in their attempt to sort of optimize their costs and benefits and then maximize their fitness. So to me, it's a fundamental part of it, and you can't understand evolution by natural selection without taking into account ecological factors because that's a good way to get at things because you can do comparisons across different kinds of ecological zones and look at how variation affects the particular strategies that come into play and all those kinds of things. So to me, it's a central part of it, and that's where I was taught the theory of natural selection via behavioral ecology and via ecology. So my degree is in ecology, and that's where I first came across evolutionary theory. So I've never sort of seen it as anything other than a clear central pillar of how we understand the processes of evolution.
Right. I was just trying to get a better sense of how we should think about the role of ecology in animal behavior. Because, for
Right.
example, if we have individuals, two populations, for example, from the same species, and we put each of them in two different environments with different ecological conditions, and so they exhibit different behaviors. Is that because the different ecological factors they are exposed to give rise to different sets of behaviors, or is it that because they come from the same species, they have the same evolved behavior repertoire and they simply manifest it in different ways when exposed to different ecological factors?
Yeah, yeah. So studying baboons is very good for that because they show exactly the sort of pattern that you say. You find them all across Africa in different environments, and then you can do comparisons to see the extent to which local ecology shapes their behavior. And you do see very interesting patterns. You do see their behavior varying, but you also see patterns where you'd expect the behavior to vary in response to local ecology, and it just doesn't. And so that suggests either, as you said, whether that's because of a kind of phylogenetic inertia where you just don't have the variation there in the population to produce an adaptive solution to the problem being faced. So baboons have been are a really good model system to look at those kinds of processes and look at the effects of local ecology versus evolved strategies and the interplay between them. And also, you can also look at like reaction norms. You can get into life history type analyses as well. So yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the way to put it.
By the way, you study baboons. Do they also have culture?
Ours were very uncouth. I didn't think ours had much in the way of culture, but you do see variation in certain kinds of behaviour. So she's currently on maternity leave, but AJ Carter and Guy Cowlishaw had started a big project to look in the same way that Andy Whiten had looked at chimpanzees, like getting everyone who's studied chimpanzees to tell you about the different patterns of behaviour. So at the moment it's at the stage where everybody who's studied baboons has on a big spreadsheet that AJ sent round, we've all put in what we see in our populations and what varies, and so the kinds of unique behaviours that we see, and to see whether you can show that there are these potentially cultural patterns that, i.e., they're not shaped by local ecology, they're coming about through idiosyncratic cultural processes. So we do see things like our baboons eat ostrich eggs, and the ways in which they do it seem slightly different from ways they do it in other populations. But of course, not all baboons have the opportunity to eat ostrich eggs because they don't have ostriches there. So whether it's the availability of ostriches or whatever. So yeah, that was interesting to do that, the kinds of different behavioural patterns that you see across baboons. So we have to wait for the answer to that. But that's in the process of seeing, a big comparative analysis to see whether baboons do in fact show the similar kinds of cultural patterns that have been shown in chimpanzees and orangutans and the like.
Mm-hmm. I asked you about culture because thinking about humans and about things in the context of evolutionary psychology, where would you place culture exactly? Because there are different ways of thinking about it, and for example, I remember that Lida Cosmides, John Tooby, and others talked about the concept of evoked culture back in the early 90s, and it would be something like, for example, by people being exposed to different ecological conditions, the culture that would develop would be basically different patterns of behavior being expressed in those different conditions, but that would be part basically of their evolved repertoire, and it would not really be a culture as a separate entity influencing directly people's behavior. But then you get people that come from the more cultural evolutionary side of things. I don't know, people like Joseph Henrich, for example, who make a very compelling case for how, so in the context of his work, how weird psychology evolved, and he places a lot of emphasis on how culture might have influenced the evolution of this sort of psychology and processes like gene-culture coevolution. So, just to go back to my original question, where would you place culture in the context of evolutionary psychology?
So I think how you've characterized that is really good, and for a long time it was like cultural evolution was always like a bit off to the side in the evolutionary human behavior, and I think that's because it was very mathematical when it's like Boyd and Richardson's early book Culture and the Evolutionary Process was very mathematical, and I think that just seemed like, well, that's too hard for everyone to do, so in that sense, in the academic sense, it was all seen as something distinct. But of course, it's not really. And I think the more empirical work that people like Joe Henrich and people have been like Maxine Derricks and people like that have been doing, and Alex Massoudi, you're getting much more empirical work. Fiona Jordan, all the names are coming to me now, and so I think it's now sort of meshing in the way that it should, because my PhD is in anthropology, so coming from a behavioural ecology background, from an anthropological background. And when you deal with humans, the cultural and social practices are clearly part and parcel of what generates all that context and variation that I was talking about before. That is the sort of bread and butter of behavioural ecology. So, foraging practices, mating practices, parenting strategies, they're all occurring in the context of particular kinds of social practices. And sometimes those accord with behavioural ecological predictions. Right, and so there's sort of Ruth Mace's early work on the Gabbra, looking at bride prices and looking at whether you should have another son or daughter. That was all very done in a behavioral ecology framework, but it's talking about marriage, which is a social practice. You don't find it in other organisms codified in that same way. So that was a real meshing of social and cultural things, but it was always presented as behavioral ecology without worrying about where the marriage bit had even come from and why marriage practices took the form they do. And now we're looking at that as well. So I think, sometimes what you see happening it doesn't come out in according to the predictions of optimality theory that you use in behavioral ecology. And then you do have something to explain, which is where sort of the Boyd and Richardson approach, which is like, well, these farmers came from Norway and these ones came from Germany, and the land is exactly the same, but they do things completely differently. Is that because of their cultural practices, right? And not something to do with their response to local ecology per se in a very behavioral ecology way. So I think I fall on that side of things. And I've never been a big fan of the evoked culture idea. It used to be called the jukebox model, but nobody knows what a jukebox is anymore because they've gone completely out.
Yeah, we don't have those kinds of things anymore. So.
No. So, I just, and I mean, to be, I just don't think it works like that. And I think that the more empirical stuff is showing that, because it sort of suggests that confronted with a particular ecology, with a particular set of demands, you will come up with a good cognitive solution to those issues and start making kayaks if you're an Inuit, and start making particular other kinds of tools and transport if you're in the Kalahari Desert or something. And the work that's coming out now showing that people don't really have a good causal understanding of how their tools work. There's a recent study on the Hadza showing that they don't really understand why their bows and arrows function in the way they do. They have a good causal understanding, but not there are certain things that are not clear. And you don't need it, right? You can still, you go out, you kill it, you're killing animals for food all over the place, and you don't really need to understand it in a kind of deep cognitive understanding of physics in the way that might be, this cognitive niche idea that seems to go with the evoked culture would suggest. And so that being the case, it's sort of like hard to explain how that would occur, right? It doesn't seem to fit with the fact that most people don't know how the things they use work. And why is that? And a cultural process by which you inherit things culturally and just pick up what works and learn what you need. And together we all understand how those things work, but no individual could recreate their culture. No individual would know how to do it. That seems to me to fit with more with what we see. And I also think the evoked culture idea sort of lacks what you could, for want of a better word, call creativity. Mm-hmm. There's no how do you put different things together to create something novel. And to be fair to Tubi and Cosmides, they had I can't remember, it's like a chapter or something where they talk about this additional sort of creative element that does come in, which sort of undermines their own evoked culture argument a little bit. But I mean, they do recognise that there is a bit missing there, which I think the cultural evolutionary stories that, the story that people like Joe Henrich tell is more reflective of what we see in the world, in what we see in nature, so to speak.
Right. So just to talk a little bit about the brain, is the brain as a computer a useful metaphor, a scientifically useful metaphor?
I think it has been, but I think it's starting to outlive its usefulness now, because I think sometimes what happens is, you use a metaphor because we don't have the tools to understand the thing that we're studying, because we haven't studied it, right? We just don't know anything about it. So you can only use a metaphor because you don't understand what you're dealing with, and you take the relevant parts from the metaphor and you apply them. And over time, I think you get very stuck in one way of thinking because you're now taking those elements of that metaphor and you've forgotten that you're using them quite as metaphorically as you did. And I think that's the danger that's happening with the brain as computer metaphor. So, I mean, I recently read Matthew Cobb's book, The Idea of the Brain, and I watched his interview with you, which was brilliant. And I think his book is very good at highlighting where the computer metaphor is not working for us anymore, and how brains are just not like computers, and that we need to move away from those ideas if we're going to make future progress. So yeah, I think it. So I don't think it's useful anymore. I think it has been. I think we need to give it up because it's a machine. It's basing our understanding of biological systems in an inanimate object, right? And organisms are not machines, right? We sometimes say they are, but they're not. Living organisms are not like machines. And I read a very good chapter by, I think it's a guy called Daniel Nicholson, who said, he sort of says we need to move away from a world that we think of as full of things to a world that we think of as full of processes. We need a process ontology. And he gives the example of a better metaphor for a living organism is something like a candle flame, because you can see a flame, it's there, it looks like a thing, but it's not really, it's a process. And that's how we should think of organisms and systems and brains, and it gets you away from these machine-like things. And I think that's useful in real life. Well, I know science is real life, but in everyday life, I worry about these ideas to do with and then we'll all be able to upload our minds to the cloud and we'll become, and this ideas of transhumanism and we'll transcend our smelly, sweaty, terrible bodies and we'll become pure intellectual beings and it will be lovely. And I just I like smelly, sweaty bodies. And I think that, your body is part and parcel of what generates your cognitive system. It's not just a brain alone. So there are these sort of slightly worrying ideas to do with transhumanism, where you're just sort of a person, you're like a little Lego person, you can slot in bits that will work better than and that sort of worries me. So I think there's a sort of, that element is also the thing to worry about there as well. So I think that it's past its sell-by date, the computer metaphor, and there are better ways to start studying the brain. And I think I just want to say I absolutely loved Matthew Cobb's book. It's such a good read, and I think that if you want to know how you could go about studying the brain differently, that would be a good thing to read, because he really gives you a brilliant overview of what's lacking in how our understanding of neuroscience at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this book, because I guess that we also have to be a little bit careful in terms of the metaphors we use, because they are always sort of culturally constrained as well, in the sense that we have a certain degree of knowledge of how the brain works, and then we also have this piece of technology that is the computer, and then we compare one to the other. I mean, and if you look back in history, people always tended to compare the brain or the psyche or something like that to some piece of technology or some sort of cultural idea that they had, which they thought worked in similar ways to how our psychology or how our brains worked. So we have to be careful of that.
You have to keep your eye. I think that's the thing. You have to keep your eye on your metaphors. They can run away from you.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is your position on modularity of mind? Because I know that originally it was a very big thing in evolutionary psychology, but now there are a few people that question the validity of this idea or of this proposal. And so what is your position on it?
Yeah, I think I understand. I mean, I'm not really a big fan of it, but I have always understand the logic behind it and what it's trying to get at. And I do recognize that modularity is a sort of feature of biological evolution in lots of ways. Like there's the segmentation, the Hox genes and all these other things where you kind of can show that modularity is. So it kind of follows from that, and it makes sense. And I think what's happened is that we've just acquired more empirical data on brain evolution, and I don't think it's fitting with a modular view. And I think it came from cognitive psychology, and evolutionary psychology, sort of the melding of cognitive psychology with evolution. And the idea that, yes, if you have a tool that serves a specific function, that will be more effective than just having a sort of big hammer that you just use for everything and you can only do, you know, the logic makes sense. I think the issue for me, and it's the issue that I have with Jerry Fodor's original sort of idea of the modularity of mind, which is not the same as evolutionary psychology one, but it kind of bears resemblance, is, you know, Fodor thinks that brains are first and foremost for thinking, right? That's his position, that's what brains are for, they're for thinking. And my view is like someone like Daniel Wolpoff, or, you know, someone who says brains evolved to control movement, right? So sensory motor function is the reason for brains in the first place, not for thinking. And if you start from that position, it's harder to get to the sort of Fodorian idea of all these little, you know, unconscious input devices, perceptual devices that are completely sealed off, and then we sit in the middle as these cognitive agents deciding what we're going to do. And that's sort of not the model of mind that I subscribe to at all. And so I think with respect to modularity in a sort of evolutionary psychology setting, again, it's this idea that psychological adaptations are these algorithmic structures. And it's not clear to me how those map onto any kind of morphological structure in the brain. And I'm not making some silly argument that you have to have a bit of the brain that does this, right? But ultimately, you've got to map it onto a physical structure, because all behaviour requires underlying physical structures that natural selection can act on. So it's got to touch the brain somehow. We've got to get to the brain somehow, because it's the brain that's the organ that's evolved, right? So when you look at brain function, brains don't seem to be organised in a way that leads you to come up with a notion of modules. So there are all these like many-to-many connections, and there's this like Eve Marder, this I think that's her name, but she works on lobsters because they have giant neurons. And there was a study of her and her students, and they did this study on the lobster stomach, like the stomatogastric ganglion or something it's called. And they did some modelling, neural network modelling, and they came up with 400,000 different ways to produce one rhythm, right? So you could have, as you know, and then how does that work in terms of human behaviour? Like if you can have 400,000 ways to just produce a peristaltic rhythm in the stomach. It seems to me that when you look at it like that, maintaining some kind of structural stability doesn't seem to be that important to the brain. It's more like Olaf Sporn says, you're set up to be very redundant and be able to solve a specific task in many different ways in a homeostatic fashion so that you can always be functional. And when you look at brains like that, they seem less computer and machine-like, which is sort of what the modularity theory is tied to. It's also tied to the computational theory of mind. So I just don't see that, I think the brain itself is the modular adaptation. The concentration of nervous tissue in a particular part of your body, that's the module. But within the brain itself, I don't see how you get to modules. And I also really like, I'm a big fan of Michael Anderson's ideas about neural reuse, which undermine that argument. That much local neural structure is conserved across evolution and combined and recombined in all these different ways to serve a variety of purposes. So he's done some lovely studies that use network analysis of brains, and you can show that there's more overlap in nodes than the links between them across different tasks that you can find that people have done in cognitive neuroscience, which suggests that, compared to random networks, which suggests that nodes are being co-activated in a variety of different tasks, and when they're activated in one task, they're playing a different role to the role they play in another task. And so these notions of neural reuse that he shows in his book, he shows how you can, how evolution the evolutionary patterns you see tie in with that, and it explains a lot of the empirical data on brain function in modern humans, in brains today. It seems to me that that's the way to go, and I think that that's what softened up the notion of modularity. So even someone like Clark Barrett, and doesn't argue, as he has a very different argument now, for what modularity is about and how we think about functional specialization. But I think that's what we'd expect as we accumulate more data, as we refine our ideas. I think it's showing a change because we understand things better now and we have more data. So it's not sort of a thing you can have I think we should all be shifting our views of it, because again, it's a bit like the computer metaphor. It did a good job of getting people to do a lot of interesting work, and now we kind of can see what its shortcomings are and we can move beyond it.
Right. And do you think there's still space in psychological science for behaviorism?
That's a leading question. I certainly do. I certainly do. I think there's two answers to that as well, because I think, people say that and it's like, there's still behaviorism. People are still doing it.
Yeah.
What do you think? Yeah. Like, why do you think Facebook has taken over the world? Like, that's just pure intermittent reinforcement and operant conditioning of the entire planet. So behaviorism never went away in two senses. There are still applied behavior analysts. There are still people working in the experimental study of behavior. And they just they just have hived themselves off and, because they get such criticism, and they don't sort of engage. And what's been nice is some of these ideas to do with embodied cognition and ecological stuff, are sort of pulling some behavior analysts in because they see the connections there. And I also think a lot of modern cognitive psychologists are, in a sense, a bit like behaviorists, in the same way that birds are dinosaurs. Do you know what I mean? They're still among us. They've just put something in the middle. You've got stimulus coming in, response coming out. They've just put something there in the middle. But in every other respect, they're still following the tenets of a behaviorist program. They're just inferring cognitive processes in the middle. So I think there is a place for radical behaviorism in psychological science, because it does work and we can show that it works, and you can predict and control behavior in many ways. And there's a really good book called Addiction by Design, which is all about Las Vegas casinos. And it's just the most perfect empirical demonstration of what Skinner was talking about in his theory of radical behaviorism. So I think it's all around us. We just don't know it. It never went away.
Yeah, I mean, I also asked that question because, particularly since Steven Pinker published The Blank Slate, there's been this idea in the air that behaviorism is sort of out of fashion and it was a blank slateist approach to the mind. I mean, even though I also had people like David Sloan Wilson on the show, and he basically talked about how even Skinner himself was very much into evolutionary theory, and so even the idea that he was a blank slateist is not really that rigorous. So.
Yeah, you can find quotations where Skinner says precisely that, right? He says precisely that. He never assumed any organism is a blank slate. I think Steven Pinker in The Blank Slate did a real disservice, because and I was a bit surprised, because he's very much someone who kind of advocates for Daniel Dennett's idea of steel manning, like give the strongest possible version of the, and then show what's wrong. And he didn't do that in The Blank Slate about behaviorism. He sort of said, when the phone rings, like, the stimulus leads you to walk over to, and answer the phone, and, and he's like, that just doesn't work. That's not how people behave. And, the computational theory of mind provides a much better explanation. And he just utterly mischaracterized what a behaviorist would say, and he sort of says, no, this has more. So it's like, well, so-and-so walks over to pick up the phone because she thinks it's her friend, Diane, and she wants to talk to her, and she believes that if she picks up the phone, and it's sort of like, but you haven't really explained anything there. You've just used folk psychology and to sort of, and you've not really given me what's the computational mechanism that underpins that? That's what you told me you were going to tell me. That's what this book is about. What's the computational mechanism? Just saying she thinks it's her friend Beverly is just folk psychology. It's not a computational mechanism. You're just relying on me to go, oh yeah, of course. Whereas the behaviorist one sounds weird and alienating, and like we're just puppets who are just driven by, the stimuli around us. So I was really disappointed by that. And if you actually go away and read something by Skinner, one of his books, not sort of the behavior, I agree, a lot of behavioral, the experimental analysis behavior did become just running rats in mazes to like quite unclear ends. It did become a bit sterile in that way, but that's true of a lot of things that happen in science. But Skinner's books are really good reads, and he's not sort of this totalitarian monster that he's painted. He's like a really nice man, and he's got interesting things to say, and they make a lot of sense. And so the philosophy of radical behaviorism is a really interesting thing, and I think a lot of people who would get a lot out of it, people who declare themselves anti-behaviorist and strong cognitive psychologists would still really get a lot out of it, I think. So yeah, we should give Skinner some more love in the world. He's not a terrible man. He's a good person.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you about this concept I've read about in your work. What is enactivism?
Right. So interestingly, enactivism I think is often a bit hard for a lot of people with a psychology background to get their head around, because standard psychology and cognitive psychology, it comes from this sort of more Cartesian view of what minds are and how they function. And enactivism comes from a different philosophical background. It comes from phenomenology, so it's more concerned with experience. So what enactivism says is that cognition arises through a dynamic interaction between an organism and an environment. And so what organisms are doing is they are creating their experiences through their own actions, and through that they kind of bring forth the world in which they live. So you cannot divorce mind from environment, and you cannot divorce, in the strongest view, so it's called autopoietic enactivism, you can't divorce mind from life. So where you see life, you're also going to see mind, because an organism has to sort of resist the second law of thermodynamics. You're continually, trying to resist entropy. And that is itself part and parcel of what it means to be a cognitive organism. So it's just a very different way of thinking, and it brings in bodies and environments as part and parcel of cognition, because that's what an organism needs to create its experiences in the world, which means to kind of stay alive, avoid being eaten, get what it needs to eat, do all the jobs it needs. Everything becomes cognitive in that view.
But I mean, when you mention phenomenology, you're talking about phenomenology within psychology, or the sort of philosophical version of phenomenology? Because there's
the philosophical, the one that makes everyone, the one that gives any British person the heebie-jeebies, because it's all like content. My supervisor, my PhD supervisor, used to go, "Oh, that sounds like continental philosophy," as though that was the worst thing they could. So yeah, it comes from that sort of more Heideggerian views of being, and those kinds of things, Merleau-Ponty, those kinds of philosophers. Not the kind of phenomenology we talk about standardly in psychology. And I think people do have trouble with that, because it can sound, if you're not careful, it can sound very mystical. Do you know what I mean? It can sound right, and that's very off-putting for people trained scientifically in a particular way. It's like, oh, it just sounds, what are we got? We're all going to be, worshipping crystals and sitting in pyramids, accessing the Earth's energy or something. It sounds a bit weird, and very sort of out there, and not like scientific work could be done with it. And I think that's a mistake, because I think you can, and people do, and so there are people like Tony Chimero, he's written a really good introduction to phenomenology. He comes from that background, and he ties it to sort of Gibbs and ecological psychology to embodied cognition, and he thinks you can build up a different kind of cognitive neuroscience by taking a different stance on these things. And if you don't like the real deep, hardcore phenomenology, people like William James and John Dewey, as pragmatists, right? They still get more of those kinds of enactivist ideas into their work than say someone coming from a more Cartesian background. So yeah, but I understand the hesitance, because if you're not careful, it can sound really strange and very mystical.
Yeah. So going back to your baboons, what aspects of their sociality did you study the most?
I think we studied their social behaviour in terms of we looked at their patterns of grooming behaviour, which is and that's because, like, the social intelligence hypothesis, the social brain hypothesis, places a lot of emphasis, and did place a lot of emphasis on sort of grooming relationships as the means by which you can negotiate the demands of social life, alleviate competition, form alliances, do all this political work that would explain the evolution of brain size. So we looked a lot at that and did, like what you said earlier. We had two populations, one in the Drakensberg Mountains and one in Dahut, which is like a Mediterranean climate, and looked to see how the patterns differed across them. Also looked at maternal investment behaviour, and I'm just a very big fan of Jean Altman's work, and Baboon Mothers and Infants was one of the first sort of academic books I ever bought, and so I just had to do my own study of Baboon Mothers and Infants so I could be like Jean Altman. And then we did a lot on sexual conflict, and because Chakma baboons show a lot of infanticidal behaviour, and they do so more than other populations in East Africa, and so it's like, well, why are Chakma more vulnerable to infanticide than other populations? And that seemed to have social conflict theory was a very good way to get at that. So we looked at infanticide and social and sexual conflict. So yeah, quite a range of things.
Did you learn something new about social systems by studying baboons? I mean, what kinds of social systems do they establish?
Again, it goes back to that really good question you asked at the beginning, which was to say, because baboons have been studied for over 100 years, they're like the most studied primate, right? So there's lots of data from lots of different parts of Africa, and they go right from the very south up to the Sahara, and so you can do a lot of really nice comparative work looking at how their social systems vary with the environment. So what I learned there was to understand that there's no such thing as a sort of ahistorical population, because baboons are characterized as very behaviorally flexible, very phenotypically plastic, and they are. But you can still see these little pockets where their behavior does not shift to reflect their ecology. And you can see that if you understand, if you look at paleogeographic patterns of rainfall and how the forests have expanded and contracted, and work out the likely expansion routes of baboons through Africa, you can see where these things have happened where group sizes became very constrained, for example. So if you're going to form coalitions, you need to have individuals that you can form coalitions with, when you can, like, two individuals gang up on a third. And you need to have choice, and you need to have sufficient. So male coalitions are seen in East Africa, but you don't see them in South Africa. And if you look at the paleogeographic patterns, it seems as though group sizes in Chakma never were large enough for males to have the potential to pick coalition partners and gang up against each other. The groups were too small. Often they were only one male groups, like a single male and females. So then you can see how So now, although groups are bigger, have expanded to reflect new geographic and ecological conditions, you still don't see coalitions because there was just never the variation there that got selected. And so you don't see coalition formation because the conditions were never such that they selected for them. Whereas in East Africa, as the baboons moved through Africa, group sizes enlarged, and there were probably more kin staying in their natal groups for longer, male kin, and that might have led to coalition formation emerging and then spreading. So I think it's this thing of recognizing that nothing is entirely plastic, right? There's always going to be a little history is always going to be sitting in there. And I think that's what we see. That's why cultural evolution and behavioral ecology in humans go together as well, because I think the same is true there. Like, just sort of historical accidents can happen and we still see their traces today, even as a lot of our behavior is adaptively fitted to its environment. I still think you can still see the mark of history in a lot of what we do.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you, what is individual level movement bias, and in what ways does it influence higher order social structures in baboon societies?
Yeah, so we did this study on movement ecology. So we took a GPS position of every animal in the group as they moved throughout the day, because you do see the animals moving in particular ways, and it was interesting. It's like, is that just random? Is it just sort of chaos? Is it just random? Do animals care where they are and like how they're positioning? And so what individual movement by, and then the other thing you see is, in our population, you would go out with the baboons, and some days they would march at top speed from one side of the reserve to the other, right? 20 kilometers, you just like vroom, right? And you'd be like, what is going on? They're on a mission today. And other days they would get up and just walk in a circle all day long, right? In the same place, just sort of meander about as though nobody knew what was going on. And it used to be so frustrating because you'd be going like, come on, when do we start marching? Like what? And so the interest, like, what explains those patterns? Why some days do they just seem like there's no leadership? They're all just wandering about, kind of not really knowing what's going on. They never really go anywhere. And then the other days they go on these marches. And so we use the GPS things to look at whether we could see whether it's particular individuals who are instigating these kinds of different patterns, or whether it's, is it one individual who dictates what goes on, or is it a more democratic process that it's all the individuals sort of shifting, and then there's a sort of consensus and everyone's off. And so what we found was that, yeah, there is this individual level movement bias. You have a set of individuals who have a lot of influence on each other, and they also have a lot of influence on more peripheral animals. So if you have this one individual who's influential and they influence the others who are also influential, you will get this sort of move in a particular direction in a march. And if you have, if those animals don't sort of influence each other together, they can't influence the periphery. So you could show that particular individuals were more influential than others. And you could show that then led to this core periphery structure, and the interplay between how the core affected itself and how the periphery was then influenced by that dictated where the animals could move. And then we said, is that just a sort of emergent property of what's going to happen whenever any animals are moving anywhere? That, the more influential ones tended to be higher ranking females, and particularly when those females were fertile and had swelling and a male was following them, then that was really like a consort pair. It was very influential. And then we did some agent-based modelling to say, does this have consequences? Does it have functional consequences? And what we could show is that when you have a core periphery structure of a particular, that sort of, where the core is large enough to be influential and the periphery will follow, you're more likely to bump into, you can more accurately find a gradient of food more often. So it could be these things have functional consequences in terms of foraging capacity and increase, and that serves everybody, even the individual peripheral animals who are sort of at the back and don't seem to be getting a good deal. They do better if they follow the pack, and because they'll access higher quality food. So that's all just a modelling exercise. So it needs to be tested empirically. But it seems to me that you can use very simple measures to get quite interesting results of how social structure is emergent as well as sort of organized by things like dominance hierarchies.
Mm-hmm. So what is social complexity? I mean, when we look into a particular animal society, what are some of the factors we take into account to say that it is socially complex?
That's such a good question. I don't know what social complexity is. I don't think anyone knows what social complexity is. I mean, we all think we do, and we have these various suggestions. Yeah. But I think partly we're sort of in a position where we need to stop and have a little bit of a rethink. And yesterday I did a PhD for someone, for a great young scientist called Rebecca Hooper at the University of Exeter, who's worked on jackdaws to test these kinds of ideas about social intelligence, relationship intelligence, all those, applying the social intelligence hypothesis to birds. And a lot of the things she finds don't really fit, but there are interesting patterns nevertheless. And we did discuss these ideas of what is complexity, and it's hard to know because there's a difference between something being complex and complicated, if you know what I mean. And when we talk about complexity, I think what we've done with the primates is go, oh, well, humans and other primates have got really big brains. They're expensive. We must be doing something with them. Social life, they also live in groups. Social life seems complex. These two things go together in some or other way. And how exactly that is and what exactly the cognitive demands of that are, I still don't think we have a very good handle on. So I think so complexity is often to do with that in a formal sense, sort of like lots of non-linear effects and things that are difficult to predict from in an additive way, and things being greater than the sum of their parts and all that kind of stuff. And that might be true, but to me, I think maybe social life in a primate group is just really complicated, right? It's just a lot going on at once, which is, and that's where the difficulty lies. It's not complex in a kind of higher level way. You've just got a lot going on, and there's lots of variation through time. And the environment is unpredictable, and animals' health state is unpredictable. They're having babies, and they're swollen, and they're not very, they're ill, and now they're rising in rank and falling in rank, and just all that stuff going on all the time seems to me complicated enough to create a demand on cognition for pattern recognition, if nothing else. So I think that's why, and in primate groups, you also have different generations living with each other, which is something Nick Humphrey said in his early paper on social intelligence, that part of it is having different animals with lots of different interests that you get when you have different age grades. And, so just all those sort of cross-cutting different kinds of categories of individual that you encounter seems to me to make life very complicated and would require good pattern recognition abilities. And if you're going to do pattern recognition, you need a big neural network, and that's what a brain is, a big neural network. And so maybe it's not so much these kind of highly intellectualized cognitive strategy, like, oh, you need to be able to take perspective and do theory of mind and inhibit pre-proto. Maybe it's not those kinds of cognitive things that we think of as particularly demanding. Maybe it's just having a really big associative engine that you can keep track of all these different patterns that are going on around you.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the aspects of baboon sociality you've studied, is there anything that we can extrapolate from baboons to humans? I mean, are there any aspects of baboon sociality that by studying them we might get a better grasp of the equivalent aspects of human sociality?
I think it's always a bit dangerous to sort of do direct comparisons between the living baboon and living humans. But I think baboons are really good. The baboons as a whole, as a group, are really good models for understanding patterns of human evolution, because the baboons emerged around the same time as the hominins. You know, their timing is the same, and they also show this pattern of spreading out through Africa over space and time in the same way that the hominids. So Cliff Jolly, who at New York University, he wrote a really great paper saying you can't use baboons as avatars, right? You can't use them as sort of stand-in humans, but they're good as analogues. So if you look at the patterns of evolution and the patterns of relationships between the different baboon species and how they have varied in space and time through evolutionary history, and then look at the fossil record, you can use the patterns you see within the baboons as a whole and apply that same reasoning to the patterns you see within the hominids or hominins. And so you can maybe understand something about human evolution like that. So he had a paper called The Seed Eaters, and he said, well, the gelada, you know, the gelada stand in relation to the rest of the baboons, like the robust Australopithecines stand in relation to the other Australopithecines. We can understand the relationships between them. So you're using them in this as analogies and as analogues, and not as little, you know, they're like little furry humans in some way. So I think that's the way to do it, and that is very useful and enlightening.
We've been talking about things like ecological factors and how the body might also influence cognition, talking about, for example, basically basically about embodied cognition. So do you think that there's still any version of genetic determinism that could be valid?
Only in a very, very limited sense. In like, if you have the gene for Huntington's disease, you're more or less going to end up having Huntington's disease. You know, if you have trisomy 21, you're going to end up with Down syndrome. I think that's the only sense where you can talk about genetic determinism in that way, that there are things that go wrong, and then if you carry those genes, that's going to happen to you. I think the whole thing about genetic determinism, we all get our knickers in a twist about all these kinds of things, because we're often talking about two different things and not understanding that we are talking about two different things. So a lot of behavioural genetics gets misunderstood like that, I think, where people, you know, there's a, you know, oh, we found the gene for schizophrenia or something like that. And no one is actually saying that. They're just saying there's a difference in people's, you know, genetic makeup, and that difference seems to make a difference to whether you're going to develop schizophrenia or not. And that's not saying development isn't part and parcel of that. You know, it's just saying and so if you think of genes as difference makers rather than being for things, you can see how shifts in people's genetic makeup might lead them to be more likely to develop something. But that's not being genetic determinist, right? That's just saying there are differences that make a difference. So I think people get a bit exercised by these things because we're not using our language in the best ways, and people are misunderstanding each other because they're not quite sure what's being presented. When people look at genes and say this seems to be linked to a particular trait, they're just not saying anything about development or how it comes about through, you know, ontogeny, which is necessary for it. Nothing is going to be just come about through genes. But at the same time, I also get a bit worried. It's like weird, like, you know, when if I talk to another scientist, and sometimes people can get very biologically determined, it's very genetic, and I get very like, oh no, you cannot say those things. There are all these other factors that matter. And then I talk to a social scientist and they'll go, yes, genes don't matter, and if they do, it's only epigenetics, you know, and it's environment. And then I become the genetic determinist, you know what I mean? I then become the person who goes, no. If you know, so I think, you know, there's these extreme things, and I think that's what happens. And I think we just need to sort of have a better grip on these things and explain things better to, I mean, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I still encounter social scientists at my university, people in sociology and anthropology, and if you mention anything about genes, they immediately think you're talking about eugenics, right? Yeah. That's all they know about, and that's all their knowledge of all this stuff at best ends in 1975 with E.O. Wilson and his book, which just
sociobiology.
Yeah, and that just confirms their worst fears. Do you know what I mean? And you say, no, that's like actually a long time ago now, and nobody is we're not talking about eugenics. But I think there's a lot of resistance there, so it makes it hard to sort of make any case for things about genetics without immediately everyone coming up in arms about it. But at the end of the day, you're not going to get very far trying to build an organism without genes, are you? It's just not going to happen. So in that sense, genes are determining things, because you won't get very far without them. But that's very different from saying that your genes make you what you are and your genes are your destiny.
Right. So I would like to end with 2 or 3 questions about evolutionary psychology. So we've already talked about how evolutionary psychologists think about culture and the concept of the modularity of mind. What would you say are some of the biggest limitations of evolutionary psychology as it is theorized now?
I think the limitations of evolutionary psychology are the same for human behavioral ecology, which is to say that we're only going to be our theories and what we come up with are only going to be as good as our understanding of the past conditions of selection. Do you know what I mean? And so there's a big limitation there in the terms of like how well we can characterize the past, and
right.
So, but that goes for all evolutionary approaches. It's not specific to evolutionary psychology. I think that we haven't heeded the lessons of George Williams by being very wary of using the term adaptation. I think we've used adaptation a bit too freely, because adaptation is meant to be this onerous concept, and you're not really meant to go there until you're very sure that that's what you're seeing. And it's too easy to come up with adaptive stories and find evidence in support of them that don't really necessarily point to the fact that it's an adaptation. So I think that's it's not so much that's a sort of slightly different limitation. I think, and this is changing now, I think what used to be my biggest criticism was the same criticism of any psychology, which is it was very based in North American lecture theatres, and it was done on undergraduates. Undergraduates with pen and paper doing tests, right? And now, thanks to a newer generation of people like for example like Clark Barrett and Ed Hagen, people who go out into the field and are testing their ideas empirically in a way that isn't just limited to doing standard cognitive psychology with a bit of an evolutionary spin on it. So I think that limitation is being overcome, that it's getting less sort of white and Western and expanding in that way. So yeah, I think now the biggest limitation on it is often the fact that it's acquired a bit of a reputation as being a particular kind of topic, and people are a bit resistant to it. So it's a bit like you can't talk about evolutionary psychology to a lot of people because they think it's quite sexist, and they think they don't think it's telling us anything useful. They think it's just helping to reinforce the status quo, that it is just so storytelling.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the biggest limitation is a bit of a PR problem, that it's sort of got a reputation as not being particularly good science, and we need to work towards rehabilitating it in that way.
Do you think that parsimony is a good criterion to have in evolutionary psychology, or even perhaps evolutionary theory in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't. I don't think parsimony is useful in an evolutionary approach, but I will temper that. I mean, there's a sort of caveat to that. So talking about evolution as a process in the world, parsimony doesn't have to play a role, because parsimony isn't a good thing in and of itself, and evolution doesn't have to obey laws of parsimony. So we've had 4 billion years of evolution. That's an incredibly long time, and we just can't understand it. We can't get our head around it. But that's a huge amount of time to produce convoluted, messy solutions that are effective, right? And they don't. There's no, there's no need to be parsimonious if you've got so much time and you can try out all these things, and natural selection does its work. So I think those are the things I always find most interesting to talk about when you're talking about evolution, rather than sort of, these organisms of extreme perfection. I think it's more like, these weird things that you see, like, there's that nerve or whatever it is, or the artery that's like, it goes up the giraffe's neck, does a little twirl at the top and comes back down the giraffe's neck, and for no good reason, but just that it had to be like that because evolution can just tinker with what it has. So those kinds of things where, you can show how the process has been very messy and has come up with a solution that works, but isn't necessarily the most elegant solution. I think that's what, but people use parsimony as a way to make it simple, right? And I think what they're doing is saying, well, that's simpler for me to understand, right? I think that's a simpler explanation. It's simpler to say that chimpanzees grieve, and, rather than coming up with an explanation in terms of some kind of associative learning process, which seems much more convoluted and need to have many more steps and things like that. So I think it gets misused in that way. But parsimony is useful when you're doing phylogenetic analyses and you're saying, right, what's the minimum number of transitions of independent changes in a tree that we can get to this? Then it does make sense, because you don't want sort of this animal evolving wings and then losing wings and then evolving wings again and then losing wings again. There's clearly then parsimony does a good job of saying, right, okay, the common ancestor where this arose or was lost was here, and then we can explain the rest of the tree in that way. So yeah, I think parsimony, I think it gets misused because we're trying to, it's all about it's a more, I often find people use it to say, as an argument to say, oh, this is much more plausible, this is much more reasonable, but it always sort of fits their own particular worldview. It's like it's sort of in favour of their worldview. They use it in a sort of motivated way. So I think you always have to be careful of that. But yeah, I don't think evolution is a parsimonious process at all.
Right. So just one last question, and since we talked about things like embodied cognition and the influence of the environment in cognition and behavior and so on, do you think that evolutionary theory can account for those sorts of mechanisms, particularly even more so embodied cognition, or do you think that, for example, it could be part of a proposal like the extended evolutionary synthesis, where people talk about epigenetics and symbolism and language and culture and so on? I mean, do you think that we would have to expand the scope of evolutionary theory to include those sorts of things, or not?
No, I don't think we do. I think we just need to. I think we just need to stop thinking of brains as though they are isolated organs that do all the work, right? That a brain on its own can't really do anything. But we treat brains like they're the people who house them, as though, do you know what I mean? We talk about, and that's and so if you start recognizing that brains sit in bodies in environments, and we need to look at all of that together in various ways, I think you can get greater explanatory power, because sometimes things seem a bit puzzling, because you can say, this, I think jumping spiders are a really good example of this, and how crickets do go, because you say this animal doesn't have very many neurons, right? It doesn't have enough neurons. It's really smart stuff, but how can it do it with so few neurons? And then you propose quite convoluted cognitive explanations, or you're saying, oh, maybe you don't need to, you come up with these explanations that try to keep cognition in the brain. And if you just said, okay, well, maybe the structure of the of the exoskeleton can act as a filtering device. Maybe the structure of the eyes can do a lot of the work, right? It can, that seems to me exactly what you'd expect of evolution. It's a thrifty process, right? It's not going to, if it can find a cheap solution, it will. And so I think that's sort of, Mark Rowlands calls it a barking dog principle. Like, why have a dog and bark yourself? So if there is structure in the world that you can exploit, why bother building a replica of that inside your brain kind of thing? Just use the world itself. Just lean on the world to do some of that work for you. And same with bodies. Bodies can be structured to do work that would otherwise require neural control. But if there's this like gearing mechanism in this bug, right? It has the actual gears in its legs, a morphological adaptation of gears. And what that allows it to do is coordinate its jumping so that each leg goes at exactly the same time, and it gives it massive propulsion. And that propulsion is so much more accurate than it could have, like the coordination of the legs is so much more accurate than you could get with neural control, where you'd have delays. And that saves on neural tissue, which is the most, is expensive, right? So if you can build gears in the body that do work that would otherwise need to be done by expensive neural tissue, that's what you should expect to see. So it seems to me that what we need to do is precisely put bodies and environments into our evolutionary theorizing and get the added leg up and power that we can. And it's an extraordinarily evolutionary thing to do. It seems less evolutionary to focus just on the brain as the part that does all the work, when that is the most expensive tissue in the body.
Right. Okay, so just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
They can go to Google Scholar. Everything is on, most things are on there. I've got an academia account. A lot of papers are uploaded there. And then they can go to our website that gives details of the stuff we do and lists of our publications and things like that. I'm not on the internet very much. I have insufficient willpower to control myself. So if I can't have any social media things, because then I would never do anything else. So I'm not very online because of behaviorism and
yeah, I understand.
I've just become a zombie of the internet, so I have to limit my access. But yeah, you can, if you go to Google Scholar, you can find the work there.
Okay, so Louise, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Ricardo. It's been lovely.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. So, to keep the channel sustainable and to keep it running, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page. You have all sorts of benefits there, and any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, George Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadraiano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardes France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Brett, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.